And I just wanted to say thank you so much all for coming out, and I'm really glad that you could all be here with us today. And also to thank the New America Foundation and also the American Security Project for having us. We're really glad to have the opportunity to talk about the issue. And also to thank my two co-panelists here, who have very kindly agreed to come along and speak about their very excellent essays in the latest issue of the Washington Monthly. So joining us here is, right here, retired Brigadier General Steve Xenakis, who is the director of the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and Psychiatric Institute of Washington, and formerly the Commanding General of the Southeast Regional Army Medical Command. To my right here is Peter Bergen, who's the Schwartz Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Counterterrorism and Counterinsurgency Initiative here at New America, and also the author of some very fine journalism on Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And over there to my far right is Carl Ford, who's a senior consultant at Cassidy & Associates and was formerly the Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research in the State Department until 2003, and has also served variously in the Army, the CIA, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. So I just wanted to begin by saying a few things about this issue of the Washington Monthly, and then I'll ask each of the people up here with me to talk a little bit about some of the themes that they discuss in their piece. And then we'll open it up to some questions from you in the audience, which I'm looking forward to. So if you haven't had a chance to pick up a copy of the magazine, I urge you to. There's some outside on your way out. But basically, this issue of the Washington Monthly is a rather unusual one for us in that it's devoted entirely to a single subject, which is torture, as you can see. And since we've published it, a few people have asked me, you know, sort of, why is it that you felt the need to turn over an entire issue of your magazine to this subject? Isn't the sort of reasonable position among, you know, respectable people that torture is bad? And haven't we sort of figured that out already? And so in response, I just wanted to sort of read a couple of the lines that kick off the introduction to this package, which I think lay out the sort of simple facts that are in operation here, which are: in the wake of September 11th, the United States became a nation that practiced torture. Astonishingly, despite the repudiation of torture by experts and the revelations of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, we remain one. What was once shocking is now ordinary. And so it seemed to us at the magazine that, you know, we're a political magazine. We follow, you know, the political campaigns. And as we've watched the sort of primary season develop, we became increasingly troubled at the fact that the subject of torture and interrogation is, you know, almost entirely absent from the primary debate. It's rarely, the candidates are really questioned on this by reporters. They don't bring it up, you know, unprompted very often in their own speeches. And I think to my memory, only one question has been asked in one of the debates. I think it was the Republican debate that related to interrogation and torture. So we came to really believe at the magazine that it's not possible to take it for granted that this is a debate that will be over on the 1st of January 2009, and we can all sort of forget about it and breathe a sigh of relief. Because I think while all of the candidates have made strong statements against torture, it's a historical, the historical reality is that when presidents acquire particular powers, institutionally, the office of the presidency is reluctant to relinquish them. And Justice Robert Jackson wrote very memorably about this in his dissent to the Korematsu decision, which you'll remember allowed for the internment of Japanese citizens in World War II, where he said that these kinds of precedents lie around like a loaded gun ready to be used at any time. And that's, I think, the issue at stake when it comes to torture and interrogation policy and going forward into sort of beyond the current administration. So our fear is that, while any of the current candidates, if they were elected, might modify the practices that are used by, the Army or the CIA, that they may be reluctant to specifically ban abusive interrogation techniques outright, whether it's, you know, because of a fear of tying their hands under advice from, you know, perhaps national security experts, or, you know, just a simple desire not to appear weak on terrorism. So, you know, I think we've seen a little bit of this kind of calculation from Senator McCain's vote very recently, where he voted against a bill that would have required the CIA to adhere to the same interrogation practices as you'd find in the Army Field Manual. So that's really the background for this issue. We wanted to sort of put it front and center in the public debate in a way we sort of feared that, you know, it was slipping out of that conversation. And so we asked, in the end, 37 very distinguished people to make their case from their sort of life experience and expertise as to why the policy of torture should end without any exception for any agency of the United States government. And we wound up with some, you know, really fascinating and thoughtful responses, and I sort of won't mention them all, but we've got contributions from elected officials from both parties, 4 senators, I think. We've got former President Jimmy Carter, members of the 9/11 Commission, people from the military, the intelligence community, faith leaders, so a pretty broad mix. And just to highlight a couple of the you know, ones that I think are well worth a read, although they all are. We have Eric Fair, who's a former interrogator from Iraq, who writes a very moving piece about a subject which you still have not heard about that much, which is, I think that we have a pretty decent idea of the effect of torture on people who have been tortured, but much less understanding of how it affects the people who are asked to do it. And he writes from his own personal experience, you know, how he was asked to use some of these abusive interrogation techniques, what the effect of that was on him personally, and he's now at seminary school at Princeton. So that's a very moving essay. And the sort of counterpoint to that is a great piece by Jack Clunan, who's a former FBI agent with the Osama bin Laden unit. And he explains sort of how it is that you know, the kind of old school way, that the time-tested way that, you know, he and his colleagues would, their term was to break terrorist suspects, not through abuse or sort of psychological or physical abuse, but through intelligent questioning and rapport building and that kind of thing. And President Jimmy Carter gives a pretty interesting take on how torture is impeding the work of human rights activists around the world. And one of the last pieces is by Colonel Larry Wilkerson, who was the chief of staff to Colin Powell in the first term of the Bush administration, and also does some work here at New America. And he has a really very stirring essay on the ways in which torture erodes, you know, the U.S. military, the nation, and American power and prestige around the world. And then, of course, we have the 3 people up here with me today who have all written from very different perspectives, great essays on the subject of torture. So I just wanted to start, you know, by asking each of them a question that would sort of allow them to explain some of the thoughts which they've put forward in the magazine. And I thought I'd start with Peter here to sort of set the scene a little. And I just wondered, Peter, if you could, I guess, remind us what it is that we've gained from the policy of torture, if anything. Looking at sort of your reporting on the Al-Qaeda members that have been apprehended by the Bush administration, and, you know, the ones who have, that we know have been interrogated using some of these techniques. What have we got for that?
Well, I'm glad they used the phrase abusive interrogation techniques, because I think one of the problems that the critics of this of these policies have is by sort of using the word torture to explain everything, it's conflating a lot of different things that I think aren't really conflatable. Enhanced interrogation techniques, you know, there's probably quite a good debate whether those constitute torture. Rather than engaging in that debate, I think it's better to say that we're opposed to not, you know, torture if it ever is used, but we're also opposed to abuse and coercion, because I think these are perhaps more words that are a little clearer. What have we gained from the policy of using either abuse or coercion or torture, I took something I think I should quote, which was the claims the government made about what has been gotten out of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed since 9/11. Since he was captured. And basically it's the following. I need to read it to you. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed launched several plots targeting the U.S. homeland, including a plot in late 2001 to have suicide operatives hijack a plane over the Pacific and crash it into a skyscraper on the West Coast. A plan in early 2002 to send al-Qaeda operatives to conduct attacks in the U.S. And a plot in early 2003 to employ a network of Pakistanis to smuggle explosives into New York and to target Bush gas stations, railroad tracks, and a bridge in New York. That was the official statement of the government in 2006 when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was moved from a secret prison to Guantanamo. Now, that all sounds very frightening, except that none of those plots actually really were anything other than talk. The only one, I mean, it's hard to prove negatives, but I'm presuming they put forward the best case they could. And I'm also presuming this came after Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was either waterboarded and or coerced in some way, and was certainly in a secret prison. The only one that actually seems to be real is the plot by Ayman Faris to bring down the Brooklyn Bridge with a pair of gas cutters, which I say in the piece would be like trying to blow up the Empire State Building with a firecracker. It's just not something that's very doable. There's no doubt that Ayman Faris was a member of al-Qaeda, that he knew Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, that he was operating on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's orders. But that seems to be the only thing we've actually got out of it, because the other plans were simply, sort of blue sky kind of, chatter amongst, what should we do next kind of thing. But there's no evidence of any of these plots actually being anything other than something that was on the drawing board. So given the fact that that's all we got from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was this one Ayman Faris, let's balance against, I sort of ran a sort of counterfactual to some degree in the piece, which was, well, I mean, was this necessary anyway? Because presumably you wanted to find out about the 9/11 plot. Now, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had told the entire 9/11 plot to Yosri Fouda of Al Jazeera a year after 9/11, and basically that interview with Yosri Fouda of Al Jazeera, which you can check, was A, a piece in the London Sunday Times, B, it was turned into a book, and C, it was an hour documentary on Al Jazeera. So when you got Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, you didn't need to waterboard him to find out about what were the details of the 9/11 plot. All you needed to do was Google him. And there was a great deal of detail that he, for instance, we didn't know where United Flight 93 was going. United Flight 93, was it going to take out the White House, or was it going to take out Capitol Hill? Well, in that interview, it became clear, they said, look, it's hard to hit the White House from the air, which is true. It's a small little house surrounded by trees, whereas Capitol Hill is on a hill and is a very easy target. So that was one thing that became clear. It also became clear the role of Osama bin Laden in the plot, again for the first time, that Osama bin Laden was, that he was clued in by Ramzi bin al-Shibh, who actually traveled to Afghanistan just before the 9/11 to tell him when the plan was, when 9/11 was going to happen. Also, it became clear how the plotters communicated with Mohammed Atta, the coded correspondence they conducted, how Mohammed Atta, for instance, sent an email posing as a student named Jenny, and saying we have 19 exams, we have 19 people who want to take exams and 4 exams. So basically a code to say the number of targets, the number of hijackers, and more, really importantly, no one really knew who Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was. He had been indicted in '96 for his role in the planes plot to bring down 11 American planes, the so-called Operation Bojinka. But no one in the U.S. government, or indeed the media, or anybody else, had identified him as the operational commander of 9/11 until he gave this very detailed interview to Yosri Fouda. So the point is that in terms of the 9/11 plan, it was already out there publicly. None of this was necessary if that was. We don't know the motivations of the people involved. I mean, presumably they were hoping to find plots that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed might have known of. Faris seems to be the only one that's out there. So you weigh Faris against, the fact that, the waterboarding, what has done damage to our credibility, etc., the lack of necessity, and then most importantly for the victims of 9/11, the fact that when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed goes to trial, it's going to be very problematic, because any competent defense lawyer, the first thing he's going to say is, this guy was abused. Now, the Washington Post reported that a clean team has gone into Guantanamo and basically get the information all over again, but completely separately. U.S. military interrogators, FBI interrogators, But then there's a question of fruit of the poison tree. I'm not a lawyer, but this may be a problem. And this case is just going to drag on for years and years and years and years. Contrast that with the embassy bombing case, which is what I do in the piece, where 4 of the embassy bombers, they all got life without parole. They will molder away in complete obscurity. They're not martyrs. No classified information came out. It served a public good. The victims of the 9/11 plot of the embassy attack were in the courtroom. They testified against them. I think it's quite unlikely, as far as we know, that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed will have 9/11 victim families in the courtroom, because we don't even really know what that courtroom is going to look like. And then we had the public good of the fact that Al-Qaeda's plans for weapons of mass destruction and their research into it and their attempts to buy it became public, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the embassy bombing trial could have been a way to go. I mean, there's really no reason why that couldn't have been the case. And we, in a previous conversation when we had in this room with Guantanamo, one of the lead Guantanamo lawyers, Carrie Lamack, who was one of her mother died on 9/11, asked the question, is it possible from a legal point of view just to put Khalid Sheikh Mohammed on trial in the Southern District of New York? And he said, well, as far as he's concerned, there's really no reason why you couldn't, which I thought was sort of an interesting answer. The next administration will have to, this set of problems is going to be handed on to them, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. What you do with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who clearly is not going to go on trial before January of 2009, I don't think, is obviously a key question. Would you put him in Leavenworth? Would you put him in Florence, Colorado? Do you have a trial in the 7th District of New York? After all, that's where the crime happened. These are some interesting questions that perhaps we can get to in the Q&A.
Well, that one of the questions that I had, for Carl Ford, sort of moving on to the subject of how things have been done in the past, contrasted to the policies that the current administration decided to employ. And Carl, you've come through the Army in Vietnam and really been involved in the intelligence world at a number of different levels. And I wanted to ask you, and you touch on this a little bit in your contribution, how your superiors in both the military and in the world of intelligence I guess, dealt with the subject of any interrogation practices that could be considered, abusive in their instructions and training of you, and sort of what the, the traditional approach to these questions was when you were coming up through those institutions.
Well, first let me just say thank you to the Washington Monthly for taking this subject on, because I guess that for me, I'm still just deeply troubled that we even have to talk about this issue, have a debate about it, and that there seems to be such a large number of Americans who think Jack Bauer's tactics are, one, real life, and two, that they are legitimate and appropriate. I find that just appalling. But more directly to your question, I grew up in the tragedy and the issue that was similar to Abu Ghraib or some of the other torture issues was, of course, Lieutenant Calley, which is only almost 40 years ago now. And there was a debate then among people about, well, it's war. Things happen. And fortunately, I was very proud of my colleagues in the Army who had been to the same schools, had taken the same courses, and many had been in the same circumstances as Lieutenant Calley, who knew without any doubt that there's no question that what he did was absolutely wrong, that it was not only morally wrong, but it was unlawful, and that he was taught in his various classes that you don't have to follow unlawful orders. You as an American soldier have the right to say, no, I'm not going to do that. That goes against my conscience. That goes against everything I believe is American. That was sort of hammered into people. I mean, this wasn't something that was an obscure issue. Everybody, I think, recognized, at least at the time, that these sorts of things were just simply not acceptable. Torture in the Vietnam War occurred. There were all kinds of episodes, but that didn't mean it didn't mean that the Army or all people in the Army weren't clearly aware that that was not appropriate. Mistakes sometimes do happen, but they should be punished when they do. Now, during my early career at CIA, it was also a time when the intelligence community was being investigated. It was the church committee at that time. And I can remember sitting in my office talking to some of my colleagues, reading the front page of the Washington Post about shellfish toxin and all these various other things that we didn't know were being done. But one of the things that came out of that was a very clear, top-down driven effort to instill in every CIA officer that there was something called American intelligence. It wasn't Russian intelligence, it wasn't German intelligence, it wasn't Israeli intelligence, it was American intelligence. And that did not condone those sorts of torture and various other interrogation techniques. It was so widely discussed, it would surprise me if there was anyone who lived through that period in the CIA that wouldn't automatically say, well, what do you mean torture? Now, finally, there's a part of me as an intelligence officer who find my colleagues who will tell you, well, we've solved this mystery and solved that mystery. I'm not going to tell you that I know for a fact that they are telling a lie. And I know that they are honorable and sincere people. But if anybody tries to tell you that the intelligence community can use this sort of data in any meaningful, substantive way, just simply turn to them and say, bullshit, because that's what it is. And so not only is it un-American, but it certainly is not, in my mind, something that, as an intelligence officer, I would counter. It would immediately, I would have suspicions of whether that was really the truth, how much I could depend on it, and particularly if somebody had been in prison for a long period of time, there was nothing there much to find out. And finally, the government's efforts to paint over this is probably the most troubling aspect of all. There was a book put out in 2006, many of you probably saw it, where they came up with this new term. I'd never heard of it before. Adducing information. And clearly, well, this study was about all the various different types of interrogation that's gone on in the past, what worked, what didn't work, and clear point that there were really no scientific studies that could say either way. But the notion that we would sort of tiptoe away and be afraid to say torture or waterboarding or whatever the harsh interrogation tactics were, to think that we would try to fool people by saying adducing information, I find probably the most troubling. And it suggests that, well, I don't know what it means, but it certainly does trouble me. Thank you.
And our final speaker here today, Steve Xenakis, comes at this issue of torture from what I think is a pretty interesting perspective, which is that of a medical doctor. And Steve, I just wondered, just to begin with, if you could perhaps just talk a little bit about the particular role that doctors and medical officers have played in some of these interrogation practices and what you think the implications of that are.
Thank you again, and thank you for both helping put this edition together and our discussion today. And I'd like to answer that question, but also like to echo the sentiments of Mr. Ford, because for those of us who cut our teeth during the Vietnam era and were shaped by the lessons of My Lai and the Church Committee as young officers, to understand that everything we do as officers, and whatever professional role we have, physicians, lawyers, infantrymen, was based and was for us very important to know that there was a moral and ethical reason and a rational explanation for what we did. And to answer your question, to start off, to tell you that I'd been commissioned in 1970 and then decided after serving to go to medical school. And when I showed up as an intern, I got my new ID card because I'd been promoted, but I also got a Geneva card because I was now a physician that I've kept with me. I'm embarrassed by the picture, but but it was clearly communicated that as a military doctor, I was held to the standards and to the guidelines of the Geneva Conventions, of the Hippocratic Oath, and of the profession to now I had been the privilege to enter. And that I was a military physician, but I was a physician first. And I was going to serve the nation, and I chose to serve the nation at a very tough time when many of my friends were not going to serve. I chose to serve the nation because I felt it was strong for us to have important for us to have a strong military, and that I could help by providing the best medical care that we had to those soldiers and Marines and their families. And so the principle had always been that that physicians functioned always in that role. Now, what had been the changes that occurred since 9/11? There have been a couple here, and it's in fact how I entered into this conversation. One had been that a physician could be asked to perform a duty in a non-medical task. There's an article published in January of 2005 in the New England Journal by Jonathan Marks and Greg Block, actually talking about the interrogation practices. And physicians and other clinicians, clinical psychologists, there were psychiatrists, general medical officers, and clinical psychologists that were assigned to work for behavioral science consultation teams and to advise the interrogators on their various practices, both in terms of how to stress the subjects and also to give advice on if there was any danger or harm being inflicted on them. There are so many things wrong with that that I couldn't begin to fill up the hour. But the doctors were not acting as doctors. The doctors were acting as interrogators. And they were involved in a practice that inherently could be coercive and harmful. Well, that violates the first oath, do no harm. And we had never, ever been asked to do something like that. with all my years of service, and I served 28 years, I was the officers with whom I served in either staff or command position would say, "Doc, we rely on you to act as a doc. You're a safety net for us. And we know when we come to you, you're a trusted, neutral, objective person. You don't cross the line." And in this case, there was a line that was crossed. There are other issues that have also come up and involved not only interrogations that have been a great concern to the medical community with regard to the force feeding of hunger strikers in Guantanamo. That is a much more complicated discussion. In a simple way, at this point in time, where I am not sure if in fact hunger strikers are being force-fed. There's certainly documentation that they had been in the past, and including ways that would really cause a lot of discomfort to most of us, strapped into these metal chairs that were not intended for these purposes, just for the transportation. And unwillingly where NG tubes were placed down, and then the various nutrients were fed to them. The AMA, the APA, the World Medical Association all have stated that force feeding of hunger strikers is against their guidelines and principles. It is not as clear actually in American law, and I'm not a lawyer having to with what is the practice in the Bureau of Prisons. But the responsibility, I think, and the burden is for the military medical community to lay out very openly and transparently what the principles are and the practices for deciding that a particular individual will be force-fed. And that's not, at this point, that is still in discussion, and we're waiting to hear. I'd like to then also just conclude with the role that, as I was trying to emphasize in my paper, my short article here, of the symbolic role of physicians to be involved in anything that could be euphemistically called enhanced interrogation, inducing information, anything that appears cruel or harmful. And by doing so, we really compromise, as a nation, our moral stature. And that our moral stature, in a strategic way, and in terms of our accomplishing our mission, is fundamental to what we do. I belong to a group of been fortunate that Human Rights First has brought together about 40 retired generals and admirals, all of us who have written letters to the President and Senator McCain, endorsing Common Article 3 and arguing, of course, asking that there be a clear policy against these techniques. And we have, in fact, spoken to the candidates who were asked, if you had to face a situation that required you to decide between the national interest and human rights, what would be your choice? And that one debate, that you all may have recalled, occurred a couple months ago. I don't think the answers were as clear as we would have liked to have heard. The fact is, there isn't a choice. That in today's world, human rights is basic to our national interests. To have the moral imprimatur that we are doing the right thing, that we're credible, and what we do is legitimate, is absolutely important, right from the ground level to those soldiers in Baghdad, all the way up to the White House. And so what we do and what we say here, and which is why I think it's so good that you have brought this discussion, helps us tell the world we do have, as Americans, hopefully a moral basis and a conviction about what we think is right. Thanks.
So I wanted to open this up for your questions, but I'm going to be greedy and steal the first one. And I'll just ask that when you do ask questions, if you could identify yourself first, that would be great. But my first question is for Carl Ford, and I'm sort of particularly curious, as I think are many people, about what we do about this situation going forward. And you mentioned the church committee. I wonder whether I've been, sort of giving this some thought and talking with, various legal experts, and there are people around who think that maybe the thing to do is to have something akin to the church committee, where you investigate exactly what happened, you document it all, and you begin some process of explicitly repudiating, what has happened. And I wonder whether you think that would be, a necessary sort of corrective to the policy we've seen over the last 8 years.
Well, my experience has been that one of the most important roles of Congress is education, and taking a very difficult, sometimes unsolvable problem, and have people, experts, come and talk about that particular issue, try to lay out all of the problems and prospects, not necessarily with any hope of solving it, but simply making sure that the Congress and the American people know what's going on. And so that in this particular case, I think that an investigation or a study of this would be extremely helpful. I think people underestimate how many ordinary Americans not only watch C-SPAN, but also watch the PBS news programs. This is not something that is, if they hear this from people that they trust, they are prepared to have new thoughts, new ideas about this. One of the difficulties, however, is that clearly I think we all understand that 9/11 was a huge shock to everyone. And that in those days, those hours and days after 9/11, people who otherwise would have been more rational did and said things that were they wouldn't have thought of saying any other time. I know in my own personal experience, having gone up to the Hill and was talking to one of the intelligence committees with a group of people, not just me. And before the presentations could begin, and this was, of course, in a closed session, the sort of consensus of the room was, do whatever you have to do. There were people asking, what about drugs? The notion that somehow the people coming before them would be there to get their approval to do things like that. It was really quite extraordinary. And unfortunately, I think that the administration and the intelligence community and law enforcement, we blinked. We, instead of being people who should know better, let those passions and fears and concerns get a control over us. But there are people out there that truly believe that this is the best answer to some very difficult problems. And so educating them is, I think, crucial and key, because when they hear the facts, I think they're going to be, a lot of eyes will be opened, at least.
Questions?
Yeah, Matt Rojansky from the Partnership for Secure America. Peter, I think you brought this up initially, but actually all of you sort of touched on it. And it's this notion that it's actually more important today probably not to talk about torture and use the word torture, but to talk as specifically as possible about the techniques with which we have a particular problem. Because you know, I was actually looking at Carl Ford's piece here, and my eyes roved down to Lee Gunn's, where there are these bolded lines that say torture is un-American, torture is ineffective, torture is unnecessary, and torture is damaging. And when you put all those together, what you come up with as far as a definition of torture is kind of a tautology. Anything that's all four of those things, of course we'd want to call torture and we'd want to not do. The problem is, and I think that this is what you get the defenders of the enhanced techniques responding now in the meat of the debate today, is that there's gray area around each of the things that are necessary versus unnecessary, damaging versus not damaging, etc. And so I guess my question for each of you, from the different backgrounds that you have, and in particular you, having been in the intelligence community and had a sense of maybe the things that the defenders say, we can't tell you, but it's important what we're getting here, you know, that the gray area can be shifted. What single element, if you can identify one, and I'd prefer it's something with which you're familiar instead of saying it's the law but I'm not a lawyer, does the heaviest lifting in terms of defining that boundary line between what's acceptable and what's not acceptable? So is it a moral litmus test? You know, is it a Potter Stewart, I know it when I see it? Is it, you know, a legal test? What is the test? Where is the boundary line? Because I feel like that's the crux of the debate today. Sorry for the long one.
Well, I think that part of this is that it's not surprising that most Americans don't truly understand how the intelligence community works and how intelligence fits into this. Thank God we have secrets that we don't tell everybody. But when you come to a problem like this, it's very easy for someone, it's an easy answer to say, well, if you knew what I knew, or I've got this list of things that were positives. Since I've, in my own personal experience, find that would be extraordinary if that were the case, rather than routine, that I would be skeptical until someone demonstrated to me clearly and with no ifs, ands, and buts that this was something that 1 in a million times that this had been effective. Because the fact is that this information, even if it's very good, even if it's coming from cooperating spies, has limited value. I mean, it's something that put together with other things can be very informative, but rarely, if ever, will one person and what they know be the key to unraveling a huge mystery. Now, part of that is our expectation of the intelligence community. I noticed that, for example, the American public does not expect the FBI to stop kidnappings or bank robberies. Everybody said, well, you can't do that. But they fully expect the intelligence community to stop 9/11. That there is again a lack of understanding of how these systems work and how good or bad we are. We're good at a lot of things, but fortune telling and mind reading is not one of them. And that these are where the notion that we can, with consistently and reliably, use the information from these human sources, I think is at best an exaggeration, and at worst purposely misleading. And maybe I'm wrong, but they'd have to show me. I just don't believe that the evidence of 40 years in intelligence suggests that it's incredible, the claims that they're making.
I'm sure they're not keeping all the good stuff back. I mean, that doesn't make sense. I guess here's what I would say to that. I mean, you asked for a standard. I'm not as familiar with the Army Field Manual as perhaps the gentleman on either side of me, but that seems like a reasonable standard. One standard which must be similar is the FBI, in whatever guidelines the FBI has for interrogations, and I'll give you several examples of extremely successful interrogations of some of the biggest terrorists in American history. Ramzi Youssef, who bombed the Trade Center the first time, he volunteered the whole thing within hours of being captured to somebody I quote in the piece, Bradley Garrett. Similarly, Miram al-Qanseh, who killed 2 CIA employees outside CIA headquarters in '93, he volunteered the whole thing also to Bradley Garrett without anything other than a Diet Coke as a sort of coercive interrogation technique. Mohammed Odeh, who bombed the embassy, who was one of the bombers of the embassy, volunteered almost everything as soon as he was captured in Pakistan. Al-Ali, who was one of the other attackers of the embassy, volunteered almost everything. The only person in the embassy attack who lied was Wadi al-Hajj, who was bin Laden's personal secretary. And anyway, he was essentially he perjured himself, and that it was very provable in court. And one of the problems with all this is the idea that without extraordinary measures, somehow we're too dumb to get the other information. I mean, and really, that's like the Egyptian the Egyptian security services. I'm sure the Egyptian security services don't have massive DNA labs, sophisticated, because they rely simply on torture. There is a sort of they have no other forensic techniques, and we have these other range of forensic techniques. We captured all these other people who can tell you things about somebody else, and as you know, there is no ticking time bomb. There's never in history been an example that anyone's prophet of a ticking time bomb. What happened was 9/11 happened. As Carl pointed out, there was this tremendous shock. The people who were shocked had no idea this thing was going to happen. If you look at President Bush, Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz, their mind frame was, we need to be concerned about states. So the idea that a group of loosely affiliated non-state actors would attack us was simply ideologically inconvenient with the way they saw the world. And also, just they hadn't grown up with these ideas and they didn't believe them. And so when it comes along, they overreacted, and the people involved in these decisions had a Hollywood construct of the world, which is that there are ticking time bombs. There is somebody who can give you all the information about the next 9/11. And that's not the way the world really is. And so if we just default to the people who actually really know how to do interrogations, military intelligence, and the FBI, this is all they do, is do interrogations. The army interrogations from Fort, Pachuca. None of these people, from the very beginning, they didn't use these techniques, they were called by them, and that's what we need to default back to, which is there's been decades and decades of success using the techniques that either the FBI or army interrogators have used. That seems the standard that we should be looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's also sort of my response to that question is that there's a sort of false idea or an exaggeration of the gray area. And I think there's a fairly long history of, which the United States as being one of the leaders in developing of, legal standards and prosecutions on what constitutes acceptable and unacceptable practices during times of war. There's, war crimes prosecutions, tribunals, things like that. And then, as Peter said, a very sort of well-established body of knowledge and codes of conduct among the agencies that deal with interrogation and intelligence. So until very recently, people had an idea of the standard and the line that was reasonably well defined. I mean, as Carl said, sometimes people stepped over the line, sometimes people made mistakes, but the people around them realized that a mistake had been made, and in most cases, some sort of action was taken to correct that. So I think the idea that we're suddenly in a world of gray is, one of the misconceptions that sort of needs to be overturned.
Let me just add this to it, that, and I was interested in your characterization of Lee's piece as sort of a tautological reasoning within it. What Admiral Gunn has summarized here, many hours of discussions that we have had as retired senior officers, and that we specifically decided as a group that we agreed with these 4 different reasons that we feel are distinct. and that we could also explain to the candidates as we were speaking to them. Because the discussion, as we listened to it in the debates and also listened to these politicians, would get obscured by the emotion that I personally characterize as a hysterical response to the fear and the surprise of 9/11. And therefore the fear was going to dominate and should compel us to do what, quote, whatever is necessary, take the gloves off, what has worked, and assume that what has worked in the past no longer works. All of which, those premises amongst ourselves, we disagree with. And so forth, wanted to find a very clear way of saying to these people, you don't need to let the fear somehow dominate your conversation. But it does. Fear is being exploited. And my personal belief, I'm not speaking for anybody else, fear is being exploited as we talk about, quote, the global war on terror. Terror is not a war strategy. Or that we talk about the ticking bomb scenario, which is unrealistic. Or that we think that these particular individuals, these detainees, are combatants, although we don't call them, like no other. Well, that's, from World War II, we've always said we're facing the Japanese or the Koreans or the Vietnamese, well, this is an enemy like no other. Right? So therefore, we got to do something different. And we end up doing the same thing that our army and country has always done. Very methodically, thoughtfully, and as ethically as we can, go about fighting and carrying out our national strategy. So I just want to find out what we're looking for is a way to dispel the feeling that really obscures what the principles are in Lee's piece here, and we can go further into why we've arrived at those.
Sure, I'll be back there.
David Smith from the United Nations office here in Washington. It was a bit of a shock to me to discover when Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, first became an issue. That as recently as the mid-80s, the Convention Against Torture formulated. And I was only aware of it, should be said, when the Justice Department used up at Washington, their office in Washington, seeking to go back to the record of the mid-80s to get a sense of what had been written and the record since. I'm wondering, when I hear you talk, the Geneva Convention, the Convention Against Torture, with this fundamental shift in the moral stature, I think is the phrase that you used, of the superpower of the day, is it time to revisit? Do we need to think that we've got to go back to the well in terms of how we define, how we agree that we can move forward? Or is it that we've got to go back to the Geneva Convention and the Convention Against Torture in the mid-80s and say, no, this is the bedrock, and we must observe this to the letter? Because clearly, in a sense, the letter has moved, hasn't it? And the greyness that we were talking about, the no man's land that I think we all feel we're in, does that change the nature of what we now need to move forward?
Well, I mean, I'm going to say the phrase you didn't like. I'm not a lawyer, but I do understand that the Article 3 of the Geneva Convention applies. I mean, when John Yoo wrote that the Geneva Convention was quaint, I don't think he was being completely outrageous in the sense that Geneva was certainly framed in the idea that states were involved. But my understanding is Article 3 covers anybody picked up on the battlefield, whether they're a state actor or not. So it doesn't seem that we need to fix that, if that's the question. The second question on the UN Convention on Torture, you know, that doesn't seem necessarily needed to be amended either. After all, I think the definition there is it in Geneva or the UN Convention on Torture that it's something that would shock the conscience as being sort of a standard. Similarly, you know, rendering somebody to a country where they're likely to be tortured is something that we've been doing, which again would seem to be against the convention. So it seems to me that we don't necessarily need to amend these, but we obviously do need to amend the legal framework that we're dealing with at places like Guantanamo, and also to a much larger degree, which is a black hole, is background. People sort of don't, I mean, background for a lot more prisoners at Guantanamo. We don't know what's going on there, really, at all. And it seems to be a very undercovered. But one suggestion that's been put forward by both the left and the right, Neil Cahill and Jack Goldsmith, was the idea of a national security corps. Now, would a national security corps, which would be sort of a FISA court on steroids, be the appropriate venue to try something like publishing Muhammad? That's an interesting question. Like, surely if we have this hypothetical church committee, we should not only investigate what's going on, but also recommend how to move forward. This is something that, or the House Intelligence Committee, or whatever committee that needs to look at these things. That's something to consider. But with that, a national security corps can then come freighted with all sorts of other problems. Because we've seen whenever you try to set up a new legal structure, as we did with the military tribunals, that it's open to objections that leave people in legal limbos for years and years and years. But the military tribunal system has so far been obviously a complete failure. And when we talk about torture, abuse, and coercion, I think it's also important to talk about people leaving people in legal limbos for periods of 6 years or more. And the military tribunal has so far had a success rate of 0.5%. Only one person has been convicted, and that was a plea bargain. So that's not a very high rate of success. Clearly, and now, of course, there are people in Guantanamo who are seen by their own admission senior members of Al-Qaeda. What kind of legal framework would be the best outcome for the American public? It's a question. I think military tribunals aren't very satisfactory on many levels. And so far, it's not clear if there'll be journalists allowed, which it seems to me, from a self-interested point of view, but also just in general, I think that's a problem. It's not clear if the families will be there. This would not be. This would be seen as a kangaroo court when it's not really necessary to have a kangaroo court.
It's hard for me to imagine that more international rules and regulations are going to deal with the problem. The ones we have, at least in worked and have become standards. It may serve us right as Americans if the United Nations decide to scold us a little bit by taking this issue up. But there is a reason, for a very good reason, to be black and white on this issue. For those of you who've been in the military, at least in the American military, one of the reasons we're so good, the reason we are successful, is that we leave a lot of initiative to the lowest levels of our military commands. That they are trained to follow all of the rules and regulations and follow orders, but when war starts, none of those all work. So you have to be able to let them have a real wide range of flexibility to get the job done. And it has worked marvelously. The problem is that if it's unclear that this particular torture or however we define it is acceptable maybe in some cases, that translates down into the lowest levels in a way that is very disturbing. And that they are not, they're sort of left to their own devices, and mistakes get made. I think Abu Ghraib was, for example, an example of that, where people, because it wasn't clear what was you could and couldn't do, what was right and wrong, and sort of a sense at the time of anything goes. That it was translated by people at the bottom into the things that we've seen the pictures of and the trials about. What's a shame is that the only people who paid the price for that were the people down at the bottom who did not have the benefit of somebody defining the rules for them very clearly. So if you notice, the military, you hardly find anybody in the military who doesn't agree on this issue. This is one that is black and white. And their rules, some may argue with them or not, but the point is that those rules, everybody understands them and they're clear, and there's a line you can't cross. No matter, even if your officer tells you cross it, they're taught to say, oh, sorry, I can't do that.
My question is for each of the four of you. And my name is Nick Schandelbauer. I'm a lawyer, but I'm a bankruptcy lawyer, so anyway, it's kind of far afield here.
Maybe for business.
Yeah. What you're describing, Peter mentioned a failure rate. It seems that there's been a failure rate of 100%. It seems that there is, among in terms of right or wrong, it seems that there is one position that is correct and there's one position that is incorrect. So my question to you is, who is the constituency, who is the coalition, this magical group of people that has allowed the policy to continue for so long? Could it just be that the executive hold on power? Is it really just Dick Cheney and his team of hysterical executive power lawyers? Who is holding this together?
Well, let me just say I think there's been a change from the first time that in fact, the first time I got called about the Katani case to now what I hear about the treatment. And there's certainly been a change in the role of the physicians, and so that the MDs are not involved in interrogation. There are some questions if clinical psychologists are involved. Secondly, there has been a change with regard to the involvement with hunger strikes and what the policies are. But in my observation as a senior officer, once something starts, it will change, but it is not a mysterious process, but it is clearly a well-camouflaged process. Because there is a certain sense of, and rightly so, of worry of the liability of those who had participated in the the policies and actions before. And then my other comment, just offhand, is that something happens like 9/11, and there's an emotion about it. You're a senior officer, you're faced with some decisions about things. I was, in fact, at the time, I wrote an op-ed piece for the Washington Post Outlook called Unhealthy Silence that came out of some discussions that I was having at that time with senior government officials. It is really hard. It is really hard as a senior officer to stand up and say, you know what, I think you're absolutely wrong here. I mean, and it really is, you fall on your sword. Now, the problem with falling on your sword is you can only do it once. And then you're out, as you've seen so many times. And then you're struggling with, well, if I stay, can I change policy? Can I right the ship? Can I do this? And then if you fall on your sword, as you've also seen, you start getting labeled in some way. You get characterized as, un-American. Remember all the discussion about when the generals who retired, Eaton and Batista, they retired, and should retired generals speak out or not? As if we've lost our First Amendment rights. That we've got to be loyal all the time, because you get caught up in this thing of loyalty to your civilian leadership. It is really hard.
I would just quickly say to that also that obviously politically there's just a certain barrier to, there's been some, as Steve said, some changes, some sort of, pushback and some changes to the policy. But obviously there's no veto-proof majority in Congress to do anything about this. The other thing I would say is that obviously the cast of characters is going to change after the end of this year, but as everybody has touched on in one way or another, the process of undoing this is just going to be enormously hard. I mean, sort of figuring out even just the legal aspect of it, which Peter was talking about. Do you have a national security court? Do you somehow try and put these people back into the regular court system, despite the fact that the information that was gathered on them has been, tainted by, unorthodox interrogation practices? Do you, does the president need to come in and issue a series of, new executive orders specifically overruling or, outlawing things that his predecessor put in place? Do we need to, take memos from the Office of Legal Counsel and withdraw them and write new ones? There's just going to be a certain degree of, I think, political risk in some of the more complex parts of figuring all this out. And I am very curious to see out of any of the candidates whether they're willing to kind of go through the long discussion about how is this done, what needs to be done, and whether you get sort of a full response to this from any of them. So
let me just go very quickly through what has changed, just concretely. Guantanamo, 600 people are out, so there's roughly 200 people left, so that is beginning to change. Background, we don't know because it's a sort of black hole, very journalistically. Secret prisons are supposed to be closed. I'm not sure that's actually necessarily true, so I've proved negatives, but clearly legal framework surrounding the Gizmo prisoners, Congress has revoked their ability to have a habeas petition. That may change, but so that's a potential problem. Extraordinary renditions. I don't think we're going to be rendering from countries like Italy to countries like Egypt, because we have this case that's going on in Milan right now, which I covered for the Jones. So I don't think we'll be doing any extraordinary renditions from rule of law countries, quote unquote, to some country that practices torture. It's not clear if extraordinary rendition has been completely ruled out. I don't think it already has, and bear in mind this, after all, was a Clinton administration innovation, not a Bush administration innovation. On the waterboarding, CIA says that it's not going to use it. I believe that's true. On the enhanced interrogation techniques, I think those are still on the table. So there definitely has been some progress. And by the way, on the Iraqi prisons, they're now run by a general called General Doug Stone. He's a two-star general, a very impressive guy. I don't think we're going to see another Abu Ghraib in the Iraqi prisons or anything remotely close to that. So there has been progress on all this front.
sure, over in the corner there.
This is a little bit of a follow-up. My name is Claire Valentin. I'm from the Friends Committee on National Legislation and Quaker Lobbying and Public Interest. I get calls all the time from Quakers who say, this has to stop, but what can we do? And there's a sense that the president is obviously not going to change his mind overnight. What are the other vantage points, pressure points that people can start moving forward as their candidates, but they don't seem to be, as you said, it's hard to relinquish that power once it's there. So from your vantage points, what are the other pressure points that are important to start pushing?
My background and experience, I spent 6 years up on Capitol Hill, and I think that it's a much more responsive part of our government than the executive. Both branches know how to manage constituents, manage in a very pejorative way, I'm suggesting. But clearly, people talking to their representatives and senators, talking about it in public forums back in the hometown, all of these people who take the newspapers of their state, their district, they watch it as closely, if not more closely, than the Washington Post, so that even activities back home in various places can have an impact on how people think about this issue. And clearly, it's also possible to find out which of these people need to be educated a little bit.
I'd like to ask Mr. Ford if you tell us a little bit about the Kubark Manual, which was developed in the 1950s by the CIA, maybe what the Kubark means, but also what its status is and what it did.
I know probably less than you do about it. I have read about it. I have not seen it. I have not seen it in practice. So my guess is that it is like the whole issue of enhanced interrogations is one that right now there's a very close watch on and very clear rules even at CIA. So that at this point I think that they at least are probably afraid to do anything other than a very narrow interpretation of what's legal. Indeed, I think that they will probably be more, the lawyers at CIA and elsewhere will be even more strict on this than others in the government, because it'll be their people that will pay the price if in fact these rules are not drawn very carefully. But I think that that's really more of a historical document, I find it was one of those cases where I thought I'd gone back into a time warp in terms of reading about that particular document.
Patrick Doherty from the New America Foundation. I'm interested in the consequences of take from these interrogations in two senses. One, in terms of the information that came out of interrogations and how it's going to bounce around within the intelligence system and the databases and whatnot. And to what extent is that going to, Doug Feith ran an operation for just a couple of, for 12 to 24 months, generating information on Iraq. This has been moving for a number of years. To what extent is this going to be, this information going to be firewall, any information got out of and then the other is operationally. To what extent have we acted on? Do we know about operations that have been based on this bad information? So consequences of the
let's start with the Iraq War, which was, I mean, the central part of Kevin Powell's testimony was the idea that al-Libi was the source of the idea. Al-Libi put together the three things you needed: Al-Qaeda, Saddam, weapons of mass destruction. So Libby had said that Al-Qaeda was trained on weapons of mass destruction by Saddam's regime. So that's a sort of the triptych you needed. And of course, that was completely untrue. So from an operational point of view, the biggest outcome of this has been helping to get us into Iraq, since that was arguably one of the strongest pieces of Colin Powell's testimony, which he must have at least been involved in some way, right? The extent to which this is viable, I think that's more a question for now.
Well, clearly our experience in Iraq suggests that the intelligence community is infallible. And indeed, the sort of mistakes that we made on weapons of mass destruction are the ones that are the most worrisome. And because those issues we shouldn't have missed so badly. A lot of things we can't do, but the focus of our collection, our analysis for the last 30 years has been on the issues of nuclear weapons and issues of proliferation, that sort of thing. So we've got a lot of people who know about it. We've got a lot of interest, a lot of collection focused on it. Plus, Iraq had been a priority for 15 years. Obviously, in Washington, there's only usually one or two, maybe three issues that can take up the time of the president and the people at the top. But during most of the 10 or 12 years before 2002, in fact, Iraq had been one of those top priorities. So that meant that we should have been looking at it very closely. We simply missed it. We didn't watch it very closely. And it's complicated, and I won't go into why that's happened, but there are serious problems in the community. Whether or not they're going to be resolved is unclear at this point. I'm not very optimistic that it's a case in which we've taken these problems and tried to turn them into a newspaper reporter's sort of technique and issue, expecting that, for example, an investigative reporter could find a cure for cancer before it was appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine. And the fact is that if you don't do that basic research and basic look at some of these problems, guess what? You miss it. And so this wasn't even close. This was a clear lack of information, lack of judgment, and it was known at the time. I mean, there were people within the community who were saying, you guys are crazy. What? You have to at least have some evidence to make some of these claims. Because it was like throwing red meat in front of people who really wanted to go and take care of Saddam, to say, guess what, fellas, they've started, the clock has started. They've begun to reconstitute their nuclear weapons program. After 9/11, everybody saw that differently than they had before. It suggested we can't let that go on. If that clock has started in Iraq, we got to do something. Now, what you do is a different question. So the intelligence community has one short memory. In fact, they want to write it off as a perfect storm. It's simply not true. They missed it. Have they learned their lesson? I hope so, but I don't think so. So for those who are worried about Iran and North Korea, I would say you have something to worry about. And maybe that's why this torture and enhanced interrogation has become such an issue. It's sort of the people that can't get the answer any other way and are desperately in need of answers. Sometimes they would stoop to such tactics thinking that they might work. But it seems to me as a sign of how bad we are analytically rather than how good we are.
I just want to make one short remark, which is it'd be interesting to see what's going to be the shift in the where money and resources are put to the Army. I mean, during the 90s, we had comparatively, as I've observed it, decremented our human intelligence, which may have led and contributed to the situation we are now. We also said that we weren't going to do, right from the beginning, I mean, we sort of regretted the end of the Cold War because it was pretty straightforward as a combat arms tanker infantryman, and we didn't shift to a different kind of planning and organization for the Army. And we need to think about what happens over the next 5-10 years. Do we really put more resources into human intelligence? Just look at the number of 4-stars. The 4-stars are generally combat arms people. Do we put other kinds of people in 4-star positions? Do we think about reconstruction, stabilization, all these other parts that really are the lessons learned from both Iraq and Afghanistan?
I would caution you, though, on human intelligence. It is one that the Congress and a lot of people point to. Let's spend more money. Let's have more spies. And let's go do this work better. If you look at the history of CIA operations, you find that during the Cold War, where we had so much attention focused on the Soviet Union, that there were virtually no recruited spies. They were all walk-ins. So that what you do is that you get if somebody walks in and can tell you about a particular unit or a particular factory or whatever, you have a little gold line there, but you can't target. So that the notion that we're going to do better in the next 5 years than we did throughout the Cold War, I think is not realizing the difficulties and complications of having human collectives. I wish we could, but that's not going to happen. The fact is that you can double or treble the number of people out there looking, but it doesn't change that there are some very complicated issues on the ground that make it hard. I mean, how do you work with groups that are culturally and linguistically different than Charlie Jones from Des Moines? The fact is, somebody with red hair and blue eyes walking around in Riyadh or any place in the Arab world is not going to be probably the one that's going to meet with some of the terrorist groups. And that there are all kinds of other practical reasons why it's not going to be a bonanza. Doesn't mean we don't try. But I would say that never in our history has human intelligence been the be-all and end-all of our problems. They can be very useful and helpful in giving you a lot of information, insight into something. They can also be very dangerous. And that is that they appear to be so credible. They appear to be that they know what they're talking about. That they spin a yarn that you want to hear. And if you're not very careful, they can lead you astray. Witness curveball in the Iraq episode. So human sources have pluses and minuses. They're certainly not a panacea. And most of the studies that have been done, several articles have been written by former DO officers, Director of Operations officers, who make the point about the notion that we really haven't done a lot of recruiting of spies. And so that thinking that we're going to be able to do it better in the Arab world and the terrorist third world problems better than we did in Paris and Rome and in Moscow, I think is clearly a big reach.
So I'm afraid I think we're about out of time for the questions, but I just wanted to thank you all so much for coming out and for such great questions, and to Steve, Peter, and Carl for their remarks and their contribution to the issue. And please, if you didn't get one on the way in, you can pick up a copy of the magazine on the way out. And thanks to New America and American Security Project for having us. We really appreciate it.